I am speaking to you right now as an independent political commentator, looking at the board through a strategist's lens because I need to be crystal clear about something from the jump. This is not about panic, and it is not about hyperbole. It is about reading the incentives and understanding the game as it is actually being played, not how we wish it was being played. We are watching a situation unfold that changes the fundamental math of security in North America. And if you are sitting in Ottawa or Toronto or Vancouver thinking this is just noise, you are missing the signal. Donald Trump has moved past the testing phase. He is not walking anything back. He is not testing the waters quietly anymore. We have moved into a new chapter of operational reality. You look at what happened with the military action in Venezuela. You look at the way he openly floated the idea of annexing Greenland like it was a piece of real estate on a monopoly board. And now Donald Trump has taken the step that changes the entire equation for everyone on this continent. He has threatened military action against Mexico. This is the point where the rubber meets the road. If that development does not set off every alarm bell in Canada, then the batteries must be dead. When a president of the United States starts openly threatening force against his neighbors, history tells us one thing with absolute certainty. The list never stops with just one country. Power does not contain itself. It expands until it hits a wall. And right now, the question on the table is whether Canada is ready to be that wall or if it is going to be a spectator. We are seeing a signal that he may send American troops onto Mexican soil. The justification is the cartels and the drugs. And we have heard the rhetoric about knocking out 97% of what is coming by water and hitting the land now. But you have to look past the sales pitch. Mexico turned down the offer of intervention. They said no. And the concern now is not whether the offer was polite, it is whether Trump acts on his own, just like he did in Venezuela. For Canada, that is the dangerous part. The threat toward Mexico is not vague. It is not hypothetical. It is specific. It involves boots on the ground. It involves a violation of sovereignty under the guise of security. Mexico rejected it outright, but that rejection has not slowed the momentum down one bit because we have already seen what happens when this administration decides that consent is just a suggestion. Venezuela proved that. Trump has made it abundantly clear that he views military force not as a last resort when diplomacy fails, but as a legitimate primary policy tool to get what he wants. More importantly, he has shown that he believes borders and sovereignty and even international law are negotiable items if they stand in the way of an objective. That is what makes this moment different. This is not diplomatic pressure. This is coercion. And coercion does not stay contained in a box. It bleeds over. Canada is not a bystander in this story. You have to understand how the map looks from the Oval Office. From the very beginning of this latest political chapter, Canada and Mexico have been treated as a package deal. When Trump talks about border security or fentanyl or trade enforcement, he consistently lumps the two countries together regardless of the facts or the scale or the responsibility. That framing matters. It matters because it shows how Trump sees North America. He does not see three sovereign partners engaging in mutual respect. He sees one pressure zone where force and tariffs and threats can be applied interchangeably to get a result. Canada has heard this language before. We have heard the 51st state comments. We have heard the questions about the legitimacy of borders. We have heard the dismissive rhetoric about sovereignty. Now you add military threats against Mexico to that context, and suddenly the picture looks far more dangerous. Look at the progression here. First, you had Venezuela framed as a security issue. Then you had Greenland framed as national defense. Now you have Mexico framed as counterterrorism. Different justifications, same underlying logic. The logic is that the United States has the right to intervene anywhere in the Western Hemisphere if it decides it is in its interest to do so. That is a profound shift. It is a rollback of decades of diplomatic norms, and Canada, whether it likes it or not, sits directly in the path of that logic. Analysts are saying Canada could be the most exposed. If you are viewed as weak or if you are doing things that the administration does not like, you fall into one of two buckets. You can be an ally or you can be an adversary. You can be Canada or you can be Venezuela. But the risk is that you get rolled over either way. In a recent interview, the former president said he is not constrained by international law or Congress, but only by his own morality. He said that is the only thing that can stop him. That needs to be said clearly because it tells you exactly what the guardrails are. There aren't any. The most serious risk for Canada is not tanks rolling across the border tomorrow. It is something more subtle and honestly more realistic. It is implicit coercion. It is assumed authority. It is unilateral actions justified as security measures. This could take the form of increased military presence in Canadian airspace or waters without asking. It could involve temporary patrols that become permanent. It could involve decisions being made for Canada, not with Canada. And once those precedents are set, sovereignty does not disappear overnight, it erodes. It chips away piece by piece until you wake up one day and realize you are a junior partner in your own country. Greenland and Mexico may seem like they are a million miles apart in terms of geography and climate, but they are not. They are both pieces of a much larger puzzle. That puzzle is control over the hemisphere. The fixation on Greenland was always about the Arctic. It was about shipping lanes and energy access and military positioning as the ice melts and the competition intensifies. Canada has infrastructure in the Arctic that is still developing. The presence there, while growing, remains thin in critical areas. That creates temptation, not the temptation for conquest in the old school sense, but the temptation for assumption, assuming patrols are necessary, assuming authority in the name of shared security, assuming Canada will accept it quietly because it has no other choice. That is how sovereignty gets tested. It is not a bang, it is a whisper that gets louder. With the capture of Maduro and the talk of taking over Greenland, plus all those threats last year, I think the conversation about Canada being a contender for the 51st state has moved from a joke to a strategic concern. That propelled the question of whether Canada is under threat. Not exactly under attack, but under threat of having its agency removed. Many experts are increasingly concerned by the moves from the administration because in the last 2 weeks, there has been another shift. Another fundamental shift that suggests the world is even more dangerous now for Canada than it was before. The concerns stem from that statement about wanting to acquire Greenland for security reasons and discussing options, including the military. When you have experts saying Canada should be prepared for possible military coercion, that is not something you gloss over. The administration might try to use explicit or implicit pressure either in the Arctic or with respect to boundaries that have already been declared invalid by the president's rhetoric. The fact that the administration has been so explicit about intervention in Greenland has set the tone. It creates a permission structure. It says that if you are big enough and strong enough, you can redraw the lines. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that this approach weakens the entire rule-based system Canada depends on. The idea that disputes are handled multilaterally, the idea that force is constrained, the idea that borders matter. Canada has been one of the strongest defenders of that system in the Western Hemisphere, which makes it both a stabilizer and a target. But here is where the story shifts, and this is the part you need to pay attention to. Canada is not frozen. Canada is not silent, and Canada is not waiting. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has already begun insulating itself from precisely this kind of pressure. This is where competence meets chaos. You have a leader in Carney who understands the economic and institutional leverage points better than almost anyone on the global stage. He is not engaging in a shouting match on social media. He is building a fortress of credibility. Europe has been mobilized. Global leaders have openly rejected annexation rhetoric. France has warned that threats against Canada would damage the world order itself. NATO allies are paying attention. Canada is reinforcing its Arctic commitments. This is not the Canada that might have been caught flat-footed years ago. The strategy coming from the South relies on isolation. Pressure works best when a country stands alone, when you can pick them off one by one. Canada made sure that would not happen. By building alliances early and by standing visibly with other threatened regions and by anchoring itself in global norms, Canada changed the math. Any threat to Canada now would not be a bilateral issue between two neighbors. It would trigger global consequences. And even people who claim they do not care about the rules understand consequences. Threatening Mexico should alarm Canada not because war is imminent, but because it confirms that restraint is no longer assumed. But the reality that is being underestimated here is that Canada is backed and Canada is alert. This is the distinction between noise and strategy. Noise is yelling about the border. Strategy is understanding that your border relies on a network of alliances that makes violating it too expensive to contemplate. Carney represents that strategic depth. He represents the adult in the room who looks at the chaotic incentives of a disrupted world and builds a structure that can withstand the storm. It is a clash of worldviews. One view says might makes right, and the other view says competence makes strength. We are watching those two worldviews collide in real time. If you look at the board right now, you see Mexico being squeezed, and you see the Arctic being eyed, and you see the rhetoric ramping up. But you also see a Canadian leadership that is not taking the bait, but is instead hardening the defenses. That is the dynamic. It is competence versus impulse. It is institutions versus ego. And for everyone watching this unfold, the lesson is that you cannot rely on the old assumptions of friendship and unguarded borders. You have to rely on leverage. You have to rely on being too prickly to swallow. Canada is positioning itself to be exactly that. The question now is how fast can those defenses be solidified and how far will the other side go to test them? We are in a period of testing. Every day is a new stress test on the system. And so far, the system is bending, but it hasn't broken because there are people at the helm who know how to steer the ship. It is easy to get distracted by the daily outrage cycle. It is easy to look at the tweets and the sound bites and get lost in the theater of it all. But my job and what I try to do here is strip away the theater and look at the mechanics. The mechanics say that when a major power stops respecting the sovereignty of its neighbors, everyone in the neighborhood needs to lock their doors and check their insurance. Canada is doing that. And it is doing it with a level of seriousness that matches the threat. This is not about being anti-American or pro-American. It is about being pro-reality. And the reality is that the neighborhood has changed. This is independent commentary based on the facts on the ground. We are analyzing the moves as they happen. And what we are seeing is a high-stakes game of poker where one side is betting the house and the other side is playing the cards close to the vest. Canada, under Carney, is playing the long game. They are betting on stability and alliances and the rule of law. The other side is betting on disruption. We are going to see which bet pays off, but make no mistake, the stakes are sovereignty itself. Let's get down to the brass tacks of how this war is actually going to be fought, because if you think this is just about military posturing or lines on a map, you are missing the main event. The real battlefield here is economic, and that is where the rubber meets the road for every single person watching this. We talk about sovereignty and we talk about borders, but the way you break a country without firing a shot is by breaking its bank account. Donald Trump understands that better than anyone. He views the United States economy not as a tide that lifts all boats, but as a hammer, and he is looking for nails. When he looks at Canada, he does not see a trading partner, he sees leverage. He sees a surplus he wants to capture and a dependency he can exploit. This is where the introduction of Mark Carney changes the calculus in a way that Washington wasn't expecting. I want to be very clear about why Carney is a different kind of problem for the Trump style of politics. Usually when a populist leader throws a punch, they expect a political counterpunch. They want the outrage, they want the shouting match, because in a shouting match, the loudest voice wins, and nobody is louder than Donald Trump. But Carney is not playing that game. He is a central banker. He is an economist. He is a guy who speaks the language of global finance fluently, and that is a language that does not care about tweets or rallies or insults. It only cares about stability and return on investment. While Trump is threatening tariffs and threatening to rip up trade agreements, Carney is quietly signaling to the global markets that Canada is the safe harbor in the storm. That is a strategic pivot that goes completely over the heads of the people who are just looking for a soundbite. You have to look at the incentives here. Capital is a coward. I have said this 1,000 times. Money is scared of its own shadow. It runs away from uncertainty and it runs toward predictability. Right now, the United States, under this brand of leadership, is radiating uncertainty. You wake up in the morning and you do not know if a tweet is going to crash a sector or if a tariff is going to wipe out a supply chain. That is chaos, and chaos is expensive. Canada under Carney is positioning itself as the anti-chaos. They are saying to the world, look at us. We have the rule of law. We have institutions that function. We have a leader who knows how to read a balance sheet. And if you are a global investor looking at North America, suddenly the smaller market looks like the smarter bet. That is not just good governance. That is a weaponized economic strategy designed to insulate Canada from the bullying coming from the South. But do not kid yourselves about the danger of the tariffs. This is the weapon of choice. Trump has proven he will use tariffs not just for economic reasons, but for political coercion. He will slap a 25% tariff on steel or aluminum or autos, not because the economics make sense, but because he wants to force a concession on something completely unrelated like immigration or border policy. It is a hostage-taking strategy. And for Canada, that is a nightmare scenario because the economies are so integrated. We make things together. A car part crosses the border 7 times before the car is finished. You throw a wrench in that gear and the whole machine grinds to a halt. The vulnerability is real, but the defense is getting sophisticated. The mistake people make is thinking you can negotiate with Trump by appealing to history or friendship. You cannot. You can only negotiate with leverage. And Carney is building leverage by diversifying. You are seeing a push to deepen ties with Europe and with Asia, not just as a nice idea, but as a survival mechanism. If you are dependent on one customer and that customer starts acting crazy, you need to find new customers fast. That is what is happening. It is a race against the clock to reduce the reliance on the U.S. market before the hammer drops. It is not something that happens overnight, but the signal it sends is powerful. It tells Washington that Canada has options. And in a negotiation, having options is the only thing that matters. Now, I want you to think about the domestic side of this because this is where it gets interesting for the voters. In a time of global instability, competence suddenly becomes a very sexy quality. We have spent years in a political environment where entertainment value was prioritized over ability. But when the water starts rising, people stop looking for a clown and start looking for a captain. Carney represents a return to the idea that leading a country requires actually knowing how the machinery works. It is the revenge of the serious person. And that contrasts so sharply with the chaos style that it creates a clear choice. You can have the circus or you can have the spreadsheet. And I know spreadsheets are boring, but spreadsheets do not start trade wars by accident. This dynamic creates a friction point. Trump thrives on being the disruptor. He wants to break the system because he believes the system is rigged. Carney is a product of the system. He ran the Bank of England. He ran the Bank of Canada. He is the ultimate insider. So you have the ultimate disruptor versus the ultimate stabilizer. That is the clash. And Trump is going to try to paint Carney as a globalist elite who is out of touch with the common man. That is the playbook. He will say Carney cares more about Davos than he does about Oshawa. He will try to drive a wedge between the leadership and the working class. That is a potent attack. It has worked before, but it only works if people do not feel the economic pain of the disruption. If the tariffs hit and the jobs are lost and the prices go up, then the disruptor gets the blame and the stabilizer looks like the savior. We are watching a high-stakes game of chicken. Trump is betting that he can squeeze Canada hard enough to make them bend the knee before the economic fallout hurts the U.S. economy. Because make no mistake, American consumers pay for tariffs too. If he breaks the supply chain, American auto workers lose their jobs too. It is a double-edged sword. Carney is betting that he can withstand the pressure long enough for the economic reality to force Trump to back off. He is betting that the American business community, which relies heavily on Canadian trade, will eventually scream loud enough to stop the madness. It is a calculated risk. And in the meantime, Canada has to hold the line. The danger is that in the noise of the threats, people lose sight of the long game. The long game is about energy. It is about critical minerals. It is about who controls the resources of the future. Canada sits on a treasure trove of the things the world needs: lithium, cobalt, fresh water, energy. Trump knows this. He wants access to those resources on his terms. He wants Canada to be a resource colony for the American industrial machine. Carney's job is to say no, to say we are partners, not subordinates, and to back that up with the economic strength to walk away from a bad deal. That requires a spine of steel. It requires a leader who does not flinch when the insults start flying. So when you hear the rhetoric ramp up about unfair trade practices or dairy quotas or whatever the grievance of the day is, do not get distracted. Look at the underlying flows of capital and power. Look at who is building bridges and who is burning them. The economic defense of Canada is being built brick by brick. It is not flashy. It does not make for great television, but it is the only thing that stands between sovereignty and submission. And right now, that defense is being led by someone who knows where the bodies are buried in the global financial system. That is an asset you cannot undervalue. We are moving into the next phase where the threats turn into policy and the policy turns into pain. And the question is, who has the higher pain tolerance? The country fighting for its survival or the country fighting for an ego? I know where I would place my bet, but in this game, the odds change every single day. This is where we have to look at the end game, because you do not play a game this dangerous without knowing how it ends. We have talked about the military threats and we have talked about the economic leverage, but the final piece of this puzzle is psychological. Donald Trump's entire political model is built on the idea of dominance. He needs to be seen as the winner, and for him to win, someone else has to lose. It is a zero-sum worldview. He needs a foil. He needs a villain he can point to at a rally and say, I beat them, so you should vote for me. Canada has traditionally been a boring target. We are the polite neighbors. But in this new reality, being boring is not an option anymore. You are either a vassal or you are a problem. And right now, under Mark Carney, Canada is choosing to be a problem. Not a loud problem, but a stubborn one. And that is the one thing a bully cannot stand. When you look at the internal dynamics in the United States, you see the cracks in the armor. Trump is not operating from a position of absolute strength. He is operating from a position of frantic necessity. He needs distractions because the domestic promises he made are hitting the wall of reality. He promised to fix the economy, but tariffs are raising prices. He promised security, but his foreign policy is creating chaos. So he needs a scapegoat. He needs to point north and say it is their fault. They are cheating us. They are laughing at us. That is the narrative he is trying to build. And the danger for Canada is that if that narrative takes hold, it becomes very hard to dislodge. It poisons the well for a generation. That is why Carney's approach of cool detachment is so infuriating to the Trump camp. They want to fight in the mud, and Carney is standing on the pavement, adjusting his tie. It denies them the visual they crave. But let's be honest about the risks here. There is a risk that Canada cracks. There is a risk that the political pressure inside Canada becomes too much. You have provinces that rely heavily on trade with the U.S. who might start saying, cut a deal. Just give him what he wants so we can keep the trucks moving. That is the internal wedge Trump is counting on. He wants to fracture Canadian unity. He wants the Premier of Alberta fighting with the Prime Minister. He wants the auto workers in Ontario screaming at Ottawa. If he can turn Canadians against each other, he doesn't need to send the Marines. We do the work for him. That is the oldest trick in the book. Divide and conquer. And the only defense against it is a unity of purpose that is very hard to maintain in a democracy. It requires leadership that can explain to a guy in a truck in Saskatchewan why standing up to the U.S. president is worth the short-term pain. That is a hard sell, but it is the necessary sell. This is why the focus on competence matters so much. You cannot fight a culture war with another culture war. You lose that every time because you are fighting on their terrain. You fight a culture war with results. You fight it by keeping the lights on and the banks open and the trade flowing despite the headwinds. If Carney can deliver stability while the U.S. descends further into unpredictability, that contrast eventually becomes undeniable. The American voter is not stupid. They look across the border and they see a country that works, and they look at their own situation and they see constant drama. Eventually, the drama gets old. Eventually, people just want things to work. Canada is betting that sanity has a shelf life and that chaos eventually burns itself out. It is a bet on the endurance of institutions over the endurance of a cult of personality. We are looking at a timeline where the next 12 to 18 months are going to be the most volatile in the history of the relationship between these two countries. You are going to see things you have never seen before. You might see border closures. You might see targeted sanctions against Canadian officials. You might see the U.S. try to interfere directly in Canadian elections. Nothing is off the table because the guardrails are gone, but you have to remember that Canada is not powerless. We supply the energy that lights up their cities. We supply the minerals that build their tech. We are the biggest customer for 35 of their states. That is leverage. It is not something you use lightly, but it is there in the back pocket if you need it. The key is knowing when to show it and when to use it. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a moment of clarity. The old world where we could just rely on the handshake and the long, undefended border is gone. It might come back one day, but it is not here now. We are living in a world of raw power dynamics. And in that world, you do not ask for respect, you command it. You command it by being competent. You command it by being united. And you command it by being ready. Canada is waking up to the fact that it has to be a serious country in a serious time. The holiday from history is over. We are back in the trenches. And while that is scary, it is also clarifying. It forces you to decide who you are and what you are willing to defend. I look at this board and I see a lot of danger, but I also see a path through. It is a narrow path. It requires discipline and it requires nerves of steel, but it is there. If Canada holds the line, if the leadership stays focused on the long game, if the people refuse to take the bait of division, then Canada comes out of this not just intact, but stronger. We come out of it with a sense of identity that is not defined by being not American, but by being resilient. That is the prize. Sovereignty is not given, it is earned. And right now, Canada is earning it the hard way. This brings us to the bottom line. We have walked through the military threats, the economic realities, and the political stakes. The picture is clear. We are in a fight for the structural integrity of the North American relationship. The days of assuming everything will be fine because we are friends are over. Now, everything will be fine only if we are smart, tough, and strategic. The ball is in our court. The question I want to leave you with is this. In a world where the rules are being rewritten every single day, are you willing to accept the short-term cost of standing your ground, or would you rather pay the long-term price of submission? If you found this analysis useful and you want to stay ahead of the curve as these events unfold, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be here watching the moves, reading the signals, and telling you the truth about what comes next. Thanks for watching.